Namaskar. Welcome to today's Infinity Foundation discussion on Multan. We cannot speak about our dharmic heritage and history without talking of the rich legacy and traditions of the lands that now constitute present day Pakistan. The Rig Veda is believed to have been composed in the Punjab region here on the banks of the Indus River around 1500 BCE. Multan or Mulasthan was a major Hindu pilgrimage center and was ruled by Hindu sovereigns till the Chach dynasty, whose last ruler, Raja Dahir, is famous as the one to defeat the Arabs in two pitched battles at Debel before falling at the Battle of Aror. Since then, it has been centuries of demographic upheaval, economic turmoil, and political disempowerment for Hindus in Multan in particular, and Western Punjab and Pakistan in general. To discuss this and more, we have with us today Deepak Srinivasan. Deepak is a data engineer and a public markets investor with a good understanding of the financial, IT, and energy sectors. He has recently been writing about and speaking on the dharmic heritage and history, particularly in and of the displaced Hindu communities in Pakistan. I welcome you, Deepak.
Thank you, Dr. Majumdar. This is an honor. I would really, I really look forward to recording this video with you and with Infinity Foundation. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So let's begin with a rather important and relevant topic at the moment, which is on the historical boundaries of the Bharatiya civilization, which have been brought into sharp focus with recent debates on the idea of Akhand Bharat. The conception of Greater India is still encapsulated in the words Jambu Dvipe Bharat Khande Aryavarta that are part of the Sankalpa mantra in Sanatana Dharma. In my writings, I've always thought of the manner of understanding nationalism in the Indic context as being more cultural and even spiritual than just political. Our Indic civilization, right from the days of the Sindhu Saraswati civilization, has seen a decentralization of political power at various points. Firstly, among the cities like in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, then kingdoms like the Rashtrakutas, Gurjara Pratiharas, and Palas at roughly the same time. And thereafter, even countries like India and Nepal being two of the modern nation states with a significant dharmic heritage, all the while maintaining a commonality in cultural aspect. If we look back in the independence movement period, Sri Aurobindo's nationalism had a spiritual aim, the recovery of the Indian character, thought, energy, perspectives, and glory, all the while driving towards solving problems faced by humanity in a distinctly Indian spirit that draws from its glorious heritage and socio-cultural spiritual code. Rabindranath Tagore felt that the flaws of contemporary Western political civilization arose due to the bi-directional causal link that the political and the commercial had on each other, which is part of the paraphernalia of the modern state. And lastly, Swami Vivekananda, his idea of nationalism was based on the two cardinal features of Indian civilization, which is universalism and humanism. So what do you see as the underlying premise of our conceptualization of the Bharatiya civilization and what we could call Indic nationalism?
Right, thank you. So you've encapsulated how at different stages different people have conceived of Indic nationalism, and you're absolutely right that it cannot be confined to a political framework and say this is what India is. You have to, in order to understand India, you have to have an understanding of the culture and the spirituality of the country. And this perspective finds its basis in ancient texts like the Rig Veda and the Vishnu Puran. Now, let me quote to you the last hymn of the Rig Veda. It goes like this: over and over, Agni, you gather what is precious for your friend. You who stand in the path of libation, bring goods to us. Assemble, speak together, let our thoughts agree. As gods once came together to receive their portion, common in utterance, common in assembly, common in thought and feeling, I hereby utter a common purpose and make a common oblation on your behalf. Common is your resolve, your heart joined in one accord, united in thoughts, so that it will go well for you together. Now, the context behind this is that the tribe known as the Bharatas have won the battle of the 10 kings, and they offer the social compact that there must be a place for all the gods of all the tribes around the common fire. Everyone who has accepted this contract has become a Bharatiya, as Sanjeev Sanyal has recently outlined in a lecture. The underlying premise of this conceptualization is this common fire and the rule that all the gods of all the tribes must be accommodated around it. The Vishnu Puran, on the other hand, describes Bharat geographically as the land extending from the majestic Himalayas in the north to the vastness of the southern sea. This geographical delineation captures the essence of the sacred land and its remarkable diversity. So during the Puranic age, the term Bharat was widely used to denote the land, and that symbolized the profound connection that the people have with the land and its heritage. It invokes a sense of belonging, it links individuals to their history, to this diverse culture, and the spiritual ethos of our nation. It signifies an unbroken thread that connects the past, the present, and the future, and thereby it weaves a shared narrative. Now, this geographical definition of India in the Vishnu Puran also emphasizes unity within diversity. How does it do that? The towering Himalayas symbolize strength and resilience, and the expansive southern region towards the sea embodies openness to diverse cultures and ideas. This deep rooted sense of belonging resonates within the consciousness of devout Hindus everywhere, as reflected even in their ritual practices. Think about the act of immersing themselves in the purifying waters of the sacred rivers. It becomes a spiritual journey that transcends the individual self. Through the recitation of mantras, they invoke the names of revered rivers such as Ganga, Yamuna, Godavari, Saraswati, Narmada, Sindhu, Kaveri. Devout Hindus, they forge a profound connection with the collective spirit of the land, its people, and the spiritual legacy of their ancestors. In essence, this conceptualization of the Bharatiya civilization acknowledges the sacred geography, the enduring bond with the land, and the inclusive ethos that characterizes the Indic worldview. And it transcends political boundaries as well, which is why, despite being geographically located in present day Pakistan, places like Multan continue to hold significance in the cultural memory of the people, serving as integral parts of their sacred land and contributing to their sense of heritage and belonging.
Very true. And I think this whole idea of cosmopolitanism, which is so natural to the Indic way of thinking, is something that goes beyond the political, of course, and is something which is civilizational, which is even spiritual in nature. And therefore, I mean, people have often argued that the Indic nationalism or Indian nationalism is a promise to humanity because it encapsulates almost a paradoxical manner of thinking of nationalism itself, where the identity is asserted, but at the same time, the identity kind of encapsulates the whole, the entirety of humanity in a manner as well. In my introductory statements, I mentioned about, and you also did in your response just now, about the indispensable chapter of our dharmic past, which was centered around current day Pakistan, which is not geographically or rather geopolitically not connected to the modern state of India as such. This past has been meticulously erased and appropriated in large parts. For example, Ismaili missionaries in Sindh at one point successfully effected the conversions in the Sindh region by presenting Ali as an incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu, as per the work, the Dasavatar of Peer Sharams, as linguistic and literary evidence of the early development of Ismailism in Sindh by Gulshan Khaki, who wrote on this topic. It is a shame that today it seems like Pakistan's pre-Islamic history is acceptable as long it is separated from its Hindu influences. After all, it is in Pakistan that we have Katas Raj, which is an ancient Hindu temple in the heart of Chakwal in Punjab province, constructed around a sacred pond that is believed to have been created from the teardrop of Shivji. In August 2022, very recently, 1200-year-old Valmiki Mandir was formally opened to the public in Lahore. I think it is one of two temples which remain in Lahore, the other one being a Krishna temple. Another place of dharmic importance, of course, has been Multan, which we will be coming to now. And this has been said to be the capital of the renowned Trigarta kingdom, as far as I recall. And the famous Malian campaign, which offered resistance to Alexander the Great, and probably one of the most fierce resistances by Alexander the Great, was between the Malwa Confederacy and Alexander. And you have recently written about this in great detail in your writings, and said that Multan or Mulistan is probably the oldest city of the Bharatiya civilization. So could you tell us a little more about this?
Right, thank you. So what you said was right. Pakistan does have so much of our heritage, especially the places you mentioned, the Katas Raj temple. I cannot think of a single place in Punjab that would be more holy to Hindus, Punjab on either side, that would be more holy to Hindus than the Katas Raj temples. So it's a real shame that we've just forgotten these places. But coming back to Multan, yes, I've written an article about it. It's on brihat.in for those who want to read the article in full. Multan is regarded widely as one of the oldest cities in the Indian subcontinent. It's not clear if it is the oldest, but there are scholars who make that assertion. Because its history dates back to its known recorded history that we have archaeological evidence for, dates back to around 3000 BC to 2800 BC. But regardless, it holds a special significance in the timeline of the Bharatiya civilization. Look at the name Multan itself. It's derived from the Sanskrit word Mulasthana. And what does that mean? It means the place of origin. So that suggests that Multan might have been one of the earliest settlements in the region and potentially even the birthplace of Hindu Dharma. Again, this is not a consensus view, but it is one of the viewpoints. We can debate about this. But Multan's strategic location and historical prominence are evident in various texts. So, according to tradition, the city was founded actually by Rishi Kashyapa, and it was named Kashyapapuri at that time. Kashyapa was descended from Brahma himself and was the son of Manu. If you look at all the archaeological sites in that area, they date back to the early Harappan period of the Sindhu Saraswati civilization. So all of this confirms its ancient heritage. Multan is also known in historical records by different names in other countries. So we've had travelers and historians talk about it. Hecatus refers to it as Kaspapuros. Herodotus calls it Kaspaturos, and Ptolemy calls it Kaspaira. The Mahabharata, of course, like you said, depicts Multan as the capital of the Trigarta kingdom ruled by the Katosh dynasty during the Kurukshetra war. So, with all of these archaeological sites and the vibrant trading culture that Multan had and our religious heritage there, we definitely ought to see Multan as an integral part of the enduring legacy of our civilization.
Right. And that's a very important point, because that link that politics and history has kind of wouldn't say broken, but in a manner of speaking, brought us apart in the political sense, shouldn't be something which makes us forget the long-lasting and ever so present cultural, spiritual, and civilizational connect we have with the city of Multan. There is a fascinating Hindu connection to Multan in its association with Lord Narasimha and Prahlad. And it is thought that the Hindu festival of Holi originated from the Prahlad Puri temple in Multan, which was said to have been built around the pillar from which Lord Narasimha appeared to kill Hiranyakashipu. The primacy of Lord Narasimha to Sanatana Dharma, of course, can be surmised by some of the famous works, one being that of the Garga Samhita, where it has been mentioned, the Sanskrit shlok, which is quite well known, Shakaraha Shad Gunpati, Shweta Deepa Nivasa Krita, Rakaro Narasimho Yam, Akarohya Aksharo Agnabhuka, where the universal form of Sri Vishnu is being revealed as the master of the six opulences. Of course, we have the Vishnu Puran, we have the Vishnu Dharmottara Puran, Brahma Puran, Kurma Puran, and Skanda Puran discuss about Sri Narasimha. For me, Sri Narasimha stands for the creative resistance to adharmic forces. Also, as various Vaishnava acharyas have mentioned, Sri Narasimha stands as a paradox, and we were talking about paradoxes earlier. In his personification of fury as well as in his gentleness and kindness, thereby highlighting the logically irreconcilable and often paradoxical aspects of the reality that we talk of in Sanatana Dharma. And it is therefore very fascinating that Multan as a city had its own ways of creative resistance while being a sum of various paradoxes in itself. For instance, of cosmopolitan diversity and strongly held identities, of being a war-torn civilizational battleground and yet a bastion of heightened civilization in its own right and time. In light of this, what are your views on this rather fascinating association of Multan with Sri Agni Lochana Narasimha?
What you've said is pretty profound. So Hiranyakashipu, whom you've talked about, he belonged to the Kashyapa Gotra. So at the time when he was ruling over Multan, it was known as Kashyapapuri, and it was later renamed Prahladpuri after his son Prahlada ascended the throne. So there are scholars who say that the festival Holi originated from the Prahladpuri temple. And what is the story of Holi? So Holi comes from the story of Prahlada and his aunt Holika. Prahlada was a devotee, as we know, of Lord Vishnu. Holika was an Asuri. And Prahlada's father, Hiranyakashipu, wanted everyone to worship him instead of the gods. Now, if you think back to the first question you asked, I talked about the sacred compact of the Bharatas, and the rule was that there had to be a place for all the gods around the common fire, and Hiranyakashipu would not let Prahlada worship Vishnu. So that was adharma. So when Prahlada refused to stop worshipping Vishnu, Hiranyakashipu ordered Holika to sit on a pyre with Prahlada because Holika was immune to the fire. But then divine intervention occurs and Holika is burned while Prahlada was protected by Lord Vishnu. So this event symbolizes the victory of adharma over dharma, like you said. And Holi is celebrated with colorful festivities the day after Holika Dahan, even today in Multan. According to our beliefs, Prahlada is said to have personally constructed the first temple in honor of Lord Vishnu's Narsimha avatar in Multan. And the significance of this temple lies in the story of Narsimha appearing from the pillar to kill Hiranyakasipu and reward Prahlada's unwavering faith. This pillar is still incorporated in that structure, the pillar from which Lord Narsimha emerged. The temple is currently in ruins. It was destroyed in 1992, but there are efforts afoot to rebuild it. The Pakistan Supreme Court has given an order. Uh, and as you said before, um, the bonfire on the night of Holi, it symbolizes the victory of Dharma over Adharma, right? In that way, the restoration of Dharma in Multan, as symbolized by the effort to rebuild the temple, is just as much a victory of Dharma over Adharma, and we must fight to win that battle. There is profound symbolism in this, and I think that our civilization will only truly be restored when the Prahladpuri temple is back to its old glory in Multan.
Very true. And not only of the Vaishnavites, but also Multan in antiquity is said to have been the home of a sampradaya dedicated to Surya Dev, our sun god in Sanatana Dharma, centered around the Multan Sun Temple. Much like the Multan Sun Temple was a center point of similar sampradaya and tradition in Jammu and Kashmir. And among the Saura Upapuranas, the Samba Puran is very prominent. And the story goes that on the advice of Sri Krishna and Sri Narad, Samba, who was the son of Sri Krishna and Devi Jambavati, sought the help of Suryadev to cure him of leprosy, of leprosy which he acquired, apparently after mocking Maharishi Durvasa, as per the Samba Puran. And the first sun temple was built in Sambapura at the very spot where Samba received a murti of Suryadev. Even the Brahma Parvan of the Bhavishya Puran talks of three primary places, if I'm not mistaken. One of Mitravan, Mundir, and there is another one in, I think, Kalapriya, with the Sambapura in Mitravan being regarded as the permanent place of residence of Suryadev. And so the legend goes that Multan is that celebrated Sambapura. And in the Varaha Puran, it is even more direct. The reference to Multan is even more direct, with the enumeration of the three most important shrines of Suryadev, including the one at Moolasthana Astamanchala. And of course, the famous Chinese traveler Hyun Sang, I think, mentioned about the temple of Yu Fatsun, who was the Chinese, what was the Chinese name for Aditya or Surya. So what are your views about this oft forgotten chapter of our dharmic heritage, and how can we use this nuance as well to connect more deeply with the dharmic heritage of Multan?
Right. So the three the principal temples for the worship of Surya, they are in the east, north, and west. And the cities are believed to be Konark, Multan, and Surat. Because Konark is still famous. The Multan temple was the home to a prominent sampradaya dedicated to Surya. And it was, I believe, mentioned by the Greek admiral Skylax in 515 BCE, and Herodotus again in the same century, and Hyun Sang about 1,000 years after that, which you mentioned. So this was a temple that was prominent all through that period, and it's also mentioned by later conquerors and chroniclers for several centuries after that, all the way up till Aurangzeb's time. It has been destroyed and rebuilt many times since the invasion of Muhammad bin Qasim, but that resilient spirit that people had that made them want to keep rebuilding it shows how important it was and how deep rooted the belief in the divinity of the sun was. Now, the Samba Puran that you mentioned and the Bhavishya Puran talks about the legend of Samba, the son of Krishna, and how he sought the sun god's help in curing his leprosy. So, this legend reveals the story of the establishment of the sun temples. The worship of Surya has ancient roots, of course, with references found in Vedic scriptures, and the Saura tradition is a continuing tradition even until today.
Yes.
The Bhavishya Puran mentions the installation of temples on the banks of the river Chandrabhaga, and that is believed to be Multan. So that is where the Bhavishya Puran says Surya would reside permanently. And this temple, that is why it is known as the Adityanath temple. There are coins and medallions from the 3rd century BC and later periods that depict the sun god, and that reflects the popularity of Saura worship. Of course, Surya is revered in our Dharma with descriptions of his ornaments, his family life, various adventures of his found in the Puranas and Itihasas. The Gayatri Mantra also is dedicated to Surya, and the Chat Puja in Bihar. All of these exemplify the historical and ongoing significance of the sun worship. Then you look at the belief of the people of Multan that the Surya Dev would protect them from all invaders.
Right.
And it was a legend that when Alexander invaded the city, which you've talked about, he was struck by a poisoned arrow. This arrow's supposed impact spot can still be seen in the old city of Multan, and this was recorded by Hyun Sang during his visit in 641 AD. His visit provides insights into the magnificence of the temple because he describes the deity as it was a golden image of Surya, embellished with rare gems, and devotees, including kings and high ranking families from various deshas, making offerings of precious stones, a house of mercy next to the temple, providing sustenance and care for the poor and sick. The temple brought people from all around the world who came to offer their prayers. The surrounding areas had tanks and flowering groves for the visitors to explore. So there are so many historical accounts that talk about the temple and its significance and how much revenue it was generating, and all of these are recorded. Even the records of Arab travelers sheds light on the cultural and spiritual significance of the Multan Sun Temple and the sampradaya of Surya worship, and that emphasizes its place within our rich dharmic heritage.
Right. And I think that's very important because even the anecdotes of those who were, kind of from the hostile forces, from forces that were not aligned with our civilizational ethos or our way of life, including Al-Baruni when he came to Multan. And in general, his writings have a lot of disparaging comments on the Hindu way of life and civilization in general. But of Multan, he talks about various aspects, maybe not in a glorious sense, but at least in a fairly positive, fairly highlighted manner in his writings, which is important to note and understand.
He calls it the city of
Yeah.
gold or the frontiers of
Yes,
gold
yes, yes,
because
exactly.
of
And
the
he also
vast
talks about
contribution
yeah,
of Multan to the treasury, either
yeah,
through looting or revenue.
right,
And
right.
this reputation lasted until the 14th century.
Yeah. So coming to the history, the historical trajectory, so to say, we have spoken about the dharmic heritage and the history as it was till a punctuation came to be, which was with the Arabs who came into Sindh and into Multan. As I recall, there were unsuccessful expeditions to Thana in Maharashtra, in current day Maharashtra, as well as Barwas, which is in Bharuch in Gujarat. And finally, the Arabs made successful inroads in Sindh under Muhammad bin Qasim. And I already spoke about Raja Dahir's resistance, which showed a lot of resoluteness, a resilience, which was unfortunately broken because of the support of various Buddhist rulers of places like Bajra, Kaka Kolak, and Sivistan. So, as a flourishing town with a booming textile industry, as it is told, as it is spoken about in various writings, Multan was the target of various Arabic armies from the 7th centuries, such as those led by if I'm not mistaken, Al Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra and Abdul Rahman bin Shimur. So, can you tell us a little about the fierce Hindu resistance and the scale of atrocities by the marauding armies during these incursions and invasions into Multan.
Okay, so for this, I would have to rely on the account of Al Baladuri, where he talks about the third caliph of the Rashidun Caliphate, Uthman, who at that time was just a governor when Umar, the second caliph, was in power. Without seeking Umar's permission, Uthman initiated naval raids against the ports of the Indian subcontinent on his own initiative. And this is where he could not breach Thane. He tried to attack Daibul in 643 CE. Daibul port is near modern day Karachi. It's named for Devalaya, meaning temple. In this raid, the Arabs are said to have faced such a defeat that the then Caliph Umar gave a directive against sea raids completely. Then, a few decades later, in 664, during the reign of the Umayyad Caliph, Muawiyah I, that is when Al Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra leads armies on multiple raids from Persia into India. And this time, the aim is to incorporate the region into their expanding empire at that point. Al Muhallab ventured as far as Sindh, and the record shows that he launched an attack on Bana and Al Ahwar. Al Ahwar is Lahore, that is the Arab name they had for that place. And they encountered stiff resistance from local forces. This is also documented. The resistance was such that during this time, he even adopted the Indian practice of trimming the tails of the war horses. During the same year, Abdul Rahman bin Shamur, who is another notable Arab Amir, led a march from Merv to Kabul. At this point, the Kabul dynasty was the Turkshahi dynasty, and he converted over 12,000 individuals there forcibly. And at the same time, Muhallab bin Abi Sufra, with a detachment from the same region, advanced towards India. And he reached as far as Multan this time. And according to Arab accounts, he plundered the land and he returned to the army's headquarters in Khorasan, while bringing with him numerous prisoners who were coerced into converting to their faith. Many historical accounts do vary in their specific details about the nature and extent of resistance and the scale of atrocities during these campaigns. But what is clear is that during this time, Arab shipping from the mouth of the Tigris River in Iraq to the Sri Lankan coast was controlled from bases at Kutch, Daibul, and Kathiawar. This was one of the primary reasons why they chose to attack port cities first.
Right. And I think that brings us to the manner in which it was undertaken. I mean, betrayals and subterfuge have eaten away at the Indic civilization since times immemorial. As far as I recall, Ambi was king of Takshashila in current-day Pakistan, and he sided with Alexander's invading army when they invaded when they attacked Porus to teach the latter a lesson. And eventually, of course, Porus was defeated, but Ambi was also later killed by Chandragupta Maurya. There is an anecdote of Muhammad Ghori having used subterfuge before the Second Battle of Tarain, asking for time to consult with his brother, Sultan Ghiyasuddin Ghori, while secretly planning an early morning mission on the forces of Samrat Prithviraj Chauhan. And of course, in the Battle of Khanwa in 1527, when Maharana Sanga came with an army double the size of Babur, the battle was tilted towards the Hindus until Raja Shiladitya Tomar, also called Silhadi Tomar, who was the king of Raisen, completely deserted the Hindu formation with his troops and defected to Babur mid-battle. And so there have been anecdotes of some 8 centuries previously of how a more perverse form of deceit was used by Muhammad bin Qasim to annex Multan. And in a classic example of devious subterfuge, the city was said to have been successfully invaded by a sabotage of the primary channel of sustenance, as I think you have written in one of your essays. So could you tell us a little about this as well?
Right. So the trend you've outlined is very clear. And if you study the history of Spain, this was also how the Umayyads,
Yes.
the Arabs conquered Spain as well. And they have a famous saying, which is that war is deceit.
Right.
So after successfully conquering Sindh, Muhammad bin Qasim turns his attention towards Multan because it was a vital trading center in the Indian subcontinent. So he lays siege on Multan for 2 months, but Multan is heavily fortified and it proves impossible to capture. At this point, the Arabs are facing a shortage of supplies, and it's very important in war to have supplies and logistics figured out, because the army that does that is always more likely to win. So they got to a point of desperation where they even had to start eating their own donkeys to survive. It is at this time that a traitor from within Multan reveals the existence of an underground canal that provides sustenance to Multan. And then Muhammad bin Qasim exploits this information and orders the canal to be blocked. And then he cuts off the city's vital resource. Think about what this does to the city, though. If you block the canal, you deprive the city of its primary water and irrigation source, and you push the inhabitants into a dire situation. With no access to water for drinking, agriculture, essential needs, their survival becomes increasingly precarious. So, facing dehydration, famine, disease, surrender became the only viable option for survival for them. So the canal blockade created helplessness and left the people of Multan with little choice but to capitulate to Muhammad bin Qasim's forces. And when they did, the able bodied men were mercilessly massacred, the women, the children, and temple ministers, totaling 6,000 individuals, as recorded in the Chachnama, were taken captive. And that is how they managed to capture Multan.
True, and that's been the story in various, as you rightly said, in various places across the country. And the fall of Multan was a major loss to our Indic civilization, because from times immemorial there has been a geographical kind of orientation and the frontier, so to say, a natural frontier for the civilizational sustenance and existence. And Multan and the greater Punjab, the western Punjab region was, of course, part and parcel of that. Coming to the resistance part of Sindh and Multan and what constitutes as current-day Pakistan, and the dharmic resistance thereof, of course. In history, as it is taught in Indian textbooks, we often read about the successive losses suffered by Hindu forces from Tarain, Chandavar, Khandwa, Haldighati, Talikota. There are so many of them. What we are often not taught is about the centuries of resistance, if not victories, that Hindu forces had against various invading forces like the Arabs, for instance, including the momentous victory by the Gurjara Pratihar Emperor Nagabhatta I over the Arabs. Pulakashen too, of course, defeated the very first Arab naval expedition, which you mentioned about in your previous response. Vikramaditya too sent his general Avanijashraya Pulakashen, who defeated the Arabs again in Gujarat in 739 AD. And later in 776 AD, a naval expedition by the Arabs was defeated by a Sandhavi naval fleet under Aguka I. Even when Samrat Prithviraj Chauhan was defeated at the Second Battle of Tarain some centuries later, Raja Malesi Kachwaha of Amer, which is now which is Jaipur, son of the renowned Pajavan or Pajun, and Maharaja Hariraj Chauhan of Ajmer put up a fierce resistance. Iltutmish was unsuccessful in annexing Gujarat, Malwa, even Mewar with its capital in Nagra. And there are so many other such tales. I mean, Hamir Dev Chauhan defeating Muhammad Tughlaq, then Rao Jodha Rathore taking back a lot of lands from the Delhi Sultanate. So what was it that made the path so difficult for these marauding Muslim armies, so as to not be able to repeat the exploits that they had in, let's say, in Middle East, in Persia and Europe, in the same way in Bharatvarsh, because they definitely could not repeat those patterns, that swift movement which they did in all these other regions in the world.
This is such a great question, right? And I've pondered it as well, because when you look at the history of the Muslim Empire, they start the conquest of Arabia in 622 and complete it in 632 AD. And then they rapidly expand and defeat the two great empires of that region, the Byzantines and the Persian Sassanid Empire, all within the next decade. And then they expand into Egypt, Iraq, Syria, parts of Anatolia, Turkey, and into Libya, Tunisia, eventually into Spain, and at the same time expanding eastwards into Afghanistan, into Balochistan, into uh, eventually Sindh, right? But why do they stop there? Why is it that they did not manage to conquer all of India and then go all the way past into East Asia? Now, this is kind of complicated, but it is crucial to shed light on these triumphs because it presents a more comprehensive understanding of India's historical resistance against foreign invasions, which our textbooks kind of neglect. The answer has to lie in the unwavering spirit of resistance displayed by Indian rulers throughout the centuries. Like you've pointed out, the period between Muhammad bin Qasim's invasion of Sindh in 713 and Mahmud of Ghazna's invasion in 1001, that period is completely overlooked in our history books. But it was during this time that such a powerful resistance movement emerged in India. Indian rulers across various regions, from Kashmir's Lalitaditya Muktipada to the Chalukyan king Vikramaditya II in present day Karnataka, they all stood united in the face of Arab invasions, and they successfully repelled their advances and protected the Indian subcontinent. The pivotal figure in this resistance was, of course, Gurjara Pratihara Emperor Nagabhatta I, whom you mentioned. In the 9th century, Nagabhatta formed alliances with other chieftains and led a united front against the Arab invaders. His strategic leadership and military prowess proved instrumental in saving Gujarat and Malwa from falling into the hands of Arab forces. There's an inscription in Gwalior known as the Gwalior Prashasti inscription, and this immortalizes Nagabhatta's victory over the Arabs. That underscores its significance historically. And Nagabhatta was not the only one who resisted. There was Pulakesi Raja, like you mentioned, a ruler in the Bharuch region. He joined forces with a Gurjara ruler named Jayabhatta IV to fiercely resist the Arab incursions. Together, they inflicted significant defeats upon the invading Arab armies at Fallabi and Navsari. Then there's the Chalukyan king, Vikramaditya II, ruling from Badami. He acknowledged Pulakesi Raja as a stalwart defender of the southern region and a formidable opponent to those who sought to conquer his land. Then there's the Rashtrakuta leader, Danti Durga. He also played a role in supporting Pulakesi Raja's efforts, and they collectively halted the Arab invasion in Gujarat by 738 AD. Additionally, there are various smaller states in present day Rajasthan which were under the leadership of warriors like Bappa Rawal of the Guhilot dynasty. Of course, Rawalpindi in Pakistan today is named after Bappa Rawal. So they also rallied against the Arab invaders. Bappa Rawal's remarkable leadership and the unification of Rajput states not only repelled the Arab invasions, but also preserved the integrity of Chittor, which was a crucial stronghold that had been threatened by the Arab forces. So the valor and resilience demonstrated by all of these regional rulers and their armies, that is what dealt a significant blow to the Arab invaders. It forced them to retreat to the west bank of the Indus River, and this resistance extended beyond specific regions as well. When the Arabs invaded India through Punjab, they faced a united alliance led by Lalitaditya Muktipada of Kashmir and Yashovarman of Kannauj. So these powerful rulers joined forces, pushed the Arabs back, and secured a vast expanse of territory from the Karakoram to the Gangetic Dome. What we should do is celebrate these victories and make it widely known in the way that the Europeans celebrate the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, which halted the Arab invasion in Europe. The victories of our Indian rulers against Arab forces have not received the same recognition, and that has to change.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important to understand that we often present a very black and white kind of history. I mean, if you were to look at the post-Ghuraid invasion, I mean, there were four centers. You mentioned about in Rajputana, the Guhilas of Mewar. Even after the primary line, the Ravals, the Maharavals went extinct. The Maharanas, when they came forth, the Bhattis of Jaisalmer, the Chauhans of Jalore, and also in Ranthambore. These were all centers which just wouldn't relent, and it was only after a lot of concerted efforts by rulers like Alauddin Khilji and various others that they finally kind of got around to taking them into their own kingdoms, and even then being partially successful in many cases. So you also mentioned in your writings about the way in which the Emirate of Multan leveraged the religious beliefs of the Hindus to prevent formidable forces such as those of the Gurjara Pratiharas from reclaiming the city. For instance, there is this mention of the idol of Sri Adityanath Mandir being threatened, in such circumstances. So, how do you see the fundamental shift in the elements of civilizational conflict with deceit and lack of, this contextualization? Possible contextualization, I don't want to generalize, of course, and abstraction by Hindu rulers as a basis for destruction wrought on North India in the next few centuries?
Well, this is quite unfortunate, right? The Emirate of Multan under Muslim rule at that point utilized the Hindu religious beliefs to manipulate the situation, and to prevent the Gurjara Pratiharas from reclaiming the city. So the Sun Temple, which was a major source of revenue for the Muslim rulers as well, was deliberately used as a tool of humiliation and control over the Hindus. They allowed the temple to exist, but they would display a piece of cow's flesh on the deity's neck, which was a deliberate act to insult the Hindus who revered the cow as sacred. The Murti of Adityanath in Multan was not only a source of revenue but also served as a defensive measure.
Right.
Now, whenever Hindu Rajas would attempt to attack and reclaim the city, typically it would be the Gurjara Pratiharas, the Arabs would display the revered deity on the fort wall and they would threaten to break it. The Muslim rulers thus leveraged Hindus' deep religious sentiments, using the fear of the deity's destruction to dissuade their enemies from attacking. And the Pratiharas, who were powerful and posed a significant challenge to the Muslims, were influenced by their religious beliefs and they refrained from taking decisive action against the Muslim occupiers in India. So the Hindu leaders of the Pratiharas as well as the Shahi dynasties failed to grasp the magnitude of the Muslim threat, and it can be argued that this was because of their lack of foresight and statesmanship. They were parochial in their thinking and had a limited understanding of the outside world, and they just did not fully appreciate the societal storm that Islamic rule represented. While they had the ability to defeat the Muslim conquerors and defend India, their indifference and failure to act allowed the danger to eventually overwhelm them. Then there's the Rashtrakutas, who ruled over large parts of the Deccan at that time. They went even further. They befriended the Muslims, provided them opportunities to settle in their territory, build mosques, and even be governed by their own governors. This approach of accommodation and coexistence was remarkable for that time, and it stood in stark contrast to the destructive tendencies of the Muslim invaders. So the eventual capture of Multan by the Karmathian chief Jalem, that marks a turning point in all of this because the priests of the Sun Temple were massacred, the deity was broken into pieces, and the temple itself was transformed into a mosque. Now, this act symbolized the extent of the destruction that unfolded and the disregard for the religious sentiments and cultural heritage of the conquered peoples. So, this is a stark contrast between what the Rashtrakutas did and what the Karmathians did.
Right. But I just wonder because even in, for instance, 12th century texts, for instance, the Prithviraj Vijaya, there have been instances. So there is a claim made that there was a certain chivalric code and therefore a way of kind of undertaking certain things as part of the military ethos, let's say, of the Indian forces. But I just wonder whether that's a simplistic reading. I mean, in this case, of course, it's very, very evident that the religious beliefs were manipulated or were misused. But was it only that, or were there other factors also which caused the breakdown of the Gurjara Pratihara whole? Because Gurjara Pratiharas were very, very formidable to the point where they were regarded as significant opponents to all the forces in South Asia as well as in the Middle East. And many people who we used to kind of have written about the eminence of the Gurjara Pratihara. So according to you, just a sub question of sorts to my previous point, what were the other possible factors that could have possibly led to this complete collapse of sorts on the Multan belt or the region as such?
Well, it's always a combination of factors. So
Right.
one would be that the tactics of war that the invaders deployed were seen as beyond the pale for the Gurjara Pratiharas. Mm-hmm. So it constitutes unilateral disarmament in a sense. You're fighting with one hand tied behind your back. Mm-hmm. Besides that, there were also divisions within the Gurjara Pratihara dynasty itself, and that eventually weakened the dynasty and led to infighting. All of that was there. There was not enough cooperation with other Indian kingdoms at that time. That also was a factor. Yeah. Then there's, of course, the nature of war changes when the technology with which you fight war changes. And it is arguable that at that point, war fighting technology in India had faced a relative decline compared to certain other parts of the world, especially with the Arabs having had a continuous martial tradition right from the time of the Rashidun Caliphate. So they had been fighting for several centuries continuously. And when you have men with such fighting experience and you come from that kind of tradition, it does become very challenging to defend against them. And eventually all of these factors led to the collapse.
I think, yeah, I mean, although that has to be contextualized, because in the 12th century, if I recall, and even previously, there had been various confederacies which, well, fought against the Arabs, of course. And then there were a lot of intermittent kind of battles going on within as well. If you were to look at the Chalukyas, the Paramaras, the Chahamanas, the Chauhans as such, later on, this comes much later on. So I think it was a relative kind of isolation of this confederacy and the internal strife with
Right.
that of the Arabs. And of course, technology like stirrups, right? I mean, horse stirrups and cavalry stirrups,
Right.
where you could literally stand on the horse and shoot an arrow, even while retreating, were major developments, right? Which were fleet-footed. They could move fast, and and the Indian forces had more of a phalanx formation. They had more of these
Right.
block formations which went
Right.
forward. And so, yeah, I mean, definitely there was a period of relative, well, lack of advancement of sorts, or lack of evolution in a certain manner.
It's also the
Uh,
geography, right? Because when
yeah,
you cross the Khyber Pass, then it is not very hard to go from there to Bengal. It's just plains,
of course,
and you
yeah, and
can.
that's what happened, right? I mean, Bakhtiyar
Right.
Khilji went right up to Bengal and then set up
Bengal and
the
Bihar.
Sultanate
Right.
there. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
So the next point of discussion that comes to mind, and this is very important, because one is the military kind of dominance or military subjugation. The other is to do with knowledge systems, right? So Multan was a Hindu seat of learning, among other places such as Banaras, Mithila, Pratisthana, Karhada, and Sirhind. So the politics of knowledge has been a prioritized frontier of Islamist iconoclasm, right, or dominance, or imposition of a certain idea of civilization. It
Right.
was by demolishing indigenous paradigms of knowledge and replacing them with their own frameworks that the civilizational subjugation of a people was undertaken. And not only in India, in the 11th and 12th century, the Seljuks tried to create a lasting political presence with a number of scholars and saints, among them a lot of Sufi Muslim saints as well, who function under state patronage in madrasas and khanakas. So, by demolishing these indigenous seats of learning, the invading forces would incapacitate the independent thinking of the people. And recently, obviously, we have seen in the movie Kashmir Files by Shri Vivek Agnihotriji that the importance of destroying Kashmir as a Hindu seat of learning was highlighted, while the manner in which scholars in contemporary Western universities, like even in Harvard, as Sri Rajivji has mentioned in his book, are complicit in creating and evolving and imposing these anti-Indian and anti-Dharmic narratives in the garb of conceptual jugglery, like critical caste theory. So, can you tell us a little about Multan's importance as a Dharmic seat of learning, and how that made it a target for a larger civilizational shift by the invading Islamic forces in the medieval period?
So you make a very good point. This is very insidious, but it's also a very effective tactic if you want to destroy a people. You want to destroy their memory of who they are, their sense of history, their sense of knowledge, and you that makes it easier for you to treat them as a blank slate and impose your own views on them. And that is exactly what they tried to do. And Bakhtiyar Khilji, whom you mentioned, famously burned down Nalanda University.
University, yeah.
This has happened throughout the country, but Multan, of course, is one of the most important seats of learning at that time. And notably, it was considered a seat of great Hindu learning even when the Mughals were politically sovereign over Multan, which was only a few centuries ago. So these places during that time of occupation were renowned for their contributions to Hindu scholarship, and they would serve as hubs of intellectual and educational pursuits. So, a historian named Saka Mustad Khan has written about Aurangzeb's military activities. And he writes about how Aurangzeb saw Multan as being particularly recognized for its specialization in various fields, such as astronomy, astrology, mathematics, medicine. And Aurangzeb sought to suppress the independent thinking in these places and dismantle established centers of Hindu learning. So in 1669 CE, he learned that in the provinces of Tatta, which is in Sindh, Multan, and Benares, the Brahmanas were teaching their scriptures in their established schools. So these institutions attracted students from distant places who were both Hindu as well as Muslim. And these students sought to acquire knowledge from these renowned scholars. Aurangzeb obviously saw this as a threat to his religious hegemony. So, with a zealous desire to establish Islam across the length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent, he issued orders to governors across the provinces to demolish the schools and temples of the quote unquote infidels and urgently suppress the teaching and practice of the Hindu religion. So, this was a deliberate campaign to undermine the indigenous knowledge systems and
Right.
intellectual traditions associated with these seats of learning. The suppression of these centers also had a profound impact on the intellectual landscape of the region, which was expected. So, the contributions of Hindu scholars were undermined, and in many cases, their traditions and contributions were lost forever. The erasure of such knowledge centers, it inflicts harm not only upon the immediate society but also has a long lasting effect on the intellectual trajectory of the region, and that is evident in the world today.
Very true. And I think that's where you kind of deracinate the entire population, right? You make them so uprooted from conceptualization of indigenous civilizational values and ethos that even when they are politically, let's say, empowered or made independent, as we see even in today's in India today, we have a lot of areas where right from laws to the way of thinking, the way in which education and research is undertaken, for instance, we borrow from the West. We still continue to do that in a very, very active way, and that is something which is a deplorable thing. It's an unfortunate thing. But I think it had started right from that period, where people tried to systematically break down any and all indigenous Indic knowledge systems and structures thereof. So
Just
when
a
we were
small
talking about, yeah, sorry,
sorry,
go ahead. Yeah,
sorry, yeah. What I wanted to say was, yes, these systems have broken down, but I
yeah,
don't think it has completely suppressed the desire for
absolutely.
indigenous
Yes,
systems.
yes,
So when I wrote my article on Multan,
yeah,
I obviously published it on an Indian website, and I
right,
don't really have any Pakistani followers on Twitter.
right,
But I got responses and DMs from several Pakistanis, people who
yes,
lived in Multan, who said, "We
right,
were never taught these things. And
right,
we are so happy that you wrote this, and we want to learn more about this." Now,
absolutely. And
these
that's
are
it.
practicing Muslims,
Yeah,
and they still have that desire for understanding their own history. And I think that is an optimistic point worth noting, and that we should never give up on this
and
idea that we can recapture the knowledge systems and reintegrate them into our way of life.
absolutely. And I think that's a commendable thing that you have done. And I think this also applies to the European colonizers. I mean, in England, for instance, even today, people are not taught about the colonization, the period of colonization, and the atrocities that were undertaken by the British in India. It's a very glorified picture that is given. So I think it's a commendable job that you have been persistent in your pursuit of presenting this side, so to say.
Thank you.
I'm just curious. Did you come across in your readings and in your research about any alternate ways in which these indigenous, knowledge systems, or at least the repositories of knowledge, were safeguarded or were, broadcast in let's say subsurface manners, which were not kind of, which could not be gone against by the invading forces or by these iconoclasts, right? Were there other structures that were devised or evolved, which, obviously bardic tales and other things. I mean, even inscriptions are ways. There are certain texts that have come only now to the surface, right? They were often under the surface for a long time. But in your readings, especially in the context of Multan, did you come across anything of this kind?
So there are many ways in which these traditions were preserved. If you look at Multan's demographics in 1947, when partition happened, over 40% of people in Multan were Hindus.
Yes.
So clearly, they did have that continuing tradition until that time. And in fact, there are even continuing traditions in Multan today. So there is a locality in Multan where a reporter had actually written about this, about how secretly they are worshipping and maintaining Hindu shrines inside their houses,
Right.
because they know that if it comes out, they will then be attacked. And I
Right.
think this was true throughout the period of Muslim rule. We all have a puja room inside our houses, don't we?
Yes.
And these traditions pass on primarily as oral traditions, taught by father to son, by grandmother to granddaughter. That is how they've traditionally been passed on, because of course at that time we didn't have the printing press as well. So transmission of knowledge was a lot more complex at that point. Then, of course, there were schools like the ones that we read about in Multan. These were present all over India until the British came.
Right.
So it is not that they were all closed down. And if you look at the Muslim empires, a lot of them did at the local level employ Hindu administrators, and they did not really enforce in a lot of rural areas, for example, all the laws that would prevent establishment of Hindu educational institutions and things like that.
Yes. And I think that's very important. One point that you mentioned here, which is the meta dynamics of these knowledge systems, right? How does one conceptualize them, in an epistemological way, in a way of even thinking about them. For instance, verbal transmission or transmission with this Guru Shishya Parampara or within the families, right? So that there is a seamless link that has come forth. And unfortunately, in the modern age, there is this shift towards a very kind of westernized kind of perspective on that. And recently, Sri Chamu Krishna Shastriji, who's the founder of Samskrita Bharati, was talking about this, and it's very important to kind of highlight and safekeep these indigenous ways at the meta-dynamical level as well. Not just in terms of the elements, but about the very way in which we conceptualize knowledge transmission and the knowledge systems, so to say. In this interaction today, we will just keep to the medieval period, but I'll just have one point which comes to mind when we talk about this whole bid for emancipation and of resisting foreign rule, of resisting this attack on our civilization. And that is fast forwarding to the 19th century, the Battle of Chiliawala in 1849. And that stands out in history as because I think there was numerical supremacy and logistical and tactical advantage which the British had, and yet they could not prevail over the Sikhs, led by Sher Singh Atariwala ji. Now the thing is, it is very significant. This particular battle is very significant because very few people know that there have been anecdotes that say that this is what inspired a lot of subsequent insurrections, and a lot of subsequent resistances. And it hampered the siege of Multan, which had begun in 1848, of course, and subsequently also influenced conflagrations like the Indian Rebellion, or the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, the first Battle of Independence, to be correct, and the Namdhari Revolt of 1871. So could you tell us a little about the battle as well as the siege of Multan, and how this, this continuing bid for emancipation and empowerment continued into the 19th century with this particular conflagration?
So isn't it interesting how Multan has been present in every story in Indian history, starting from the Mahabharata itself, all the way to the various Muslim invasions, the Mughals, the Ghurids, the first Arab invasions, of course, and finally with the resistance to the British.
Yes.
And how it inspired the national movement for freedom. So, okay, let me give you some context to what happened before what you mentioned. The first Anglo-Sikh War happened in 1845, and it concluded with the British East India Company's victory. Then, following the war, Multan, with its population of 80,000 at that time, remained under the control of a leader named Mulraj. It was a prosperous trading center even then, and it acted as a he acted as a quasi-independent ruler under the nominal authority of the East India Company, a situation that he was still not happy with. 3 years later, in 1848, Sir Frederick Currie, the newly appointed commissioner in the Punjab, demanded that Mulraj pay back taxes and levies owed to the Sikh Empire's central darbar.
Right.
Now, if he did not pay back those taxes, the British would have attempted to completely annex Multan. So Mulraj abdicated in favor of his son and anointed Sardar Khan Singh as the Sikh monarch. Accompanying Khan Singh was Patrick Vance Agnew, a British political agent.
Right.
However, when they arrived in April 1848 to assume control of the citadel, Vance Agnew and Lieutenant Anderson were attacked by Mulraj's forces, and they were killed. So Mulraj, when because he saw himself as a rebel, he presented Vance Agnew's head to the local British authorities. And Lieutenant Edwards, the British political agent in Bannu, tried to take steps to suppress the rebellion. But his efforts were hindered by Sir Hugo, the commander-in-chief of the Bengal Army, which was, of course, the largest contingent in the British East India Company's army. And he was reluctant to expose European troops to a campaign during such harsh weather conditions. So then they had to wait until June, and Edwards led an army against Multan. And he did defeat Mulraj's forces. Then General Wish subsequently ordered a siege of Multan. At that point, the East India Company's forces had been too weakened, so they couldn't maintain the siege, and they were forced to retreat. Then, fast forward another few months, in September, that's when Sher Singh Atariwala, leading a detachment of the Khalsa army, rebelled against the East India Company and left the siege vulnerable. Then the Battle of Chilianwala happens. The Sikh Khalsa army, under the command of Sher Singh Atariwala, dealt a significant defeat to the British army. Both sides, of course, claimed victory, but it became very clear that the Sikhs eventually emerged as the recognized victors. And this battle, even in British records, has been noted as one of the toughest battles fought by the British army. And it resulted in a loss of British prestige and had repercussions that influenced events much later on, as you've mentioned, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Namdari Revolt. So, after the eventual establishment of British control in the Punjab, Sher Singh Atariwala and other formidable leaders were all exiled because the British had this concern that such influential figures had the potential to ignite future movements and foment widespread resistance against their rule. But even just the memory of these leaders, of these fighters, was enough to do that. And eventually that led to the formation of the national movement and, of course, various attempts at military capture of India from the British,
Right.
and of course ending in the Royal Naval Mutiny of 1946 and the Indian National Army under Subhash Chandra Bose and so on.
Yes. Very, very true. So we will. I'll try to take some questions from the audience. I think there was a certain reference on the Jain temples in Multan,
Right.
and there is Rashmi Karnawatji who has mentioned that my ancestors were from Jaisalmer Kshatriyas converted to
Okay.
Jainism.
Okay.
So, could you, if in your readings and research, have you come across anything on that front, on the Jainism
I have
and
actually, and I've written about this as well.
yeah,
So let me just quickly find what I've written because I want to read the entire anecdote because
yes,
this was very moving to me when I read this. Okay, so another story of partition told among the Jain community of Jaipur is that of the Jains from Multan. The community then living in Multan was worried about their murtis and Jinavani since they couldn't travel through the bus or train routes to India due to the ongoing riots. This was all in 1947. Eventually, they managed to hire a private plane from Bombay to carry their 85 murtis, household items, and people to safety in India. However, the plane was overloaded and the pilot refused to fly it. He suggested taking only a few murtis since they all looked alike. But the women in the plane were adamant about taking all the murtis and Jinavani and refused to leave them behind. Finally, they removed all the household items, but the plane was still overloaded. The pilot gave the community an ultimatum, either the people or the murtis. The community decided they would stay behind so that the murtis and Jinavani could be taken to safety. In the end, the pilot decided to take the risk of taking both while leaving behind their belongings. During the flight, the women took a pledge to not eat or drink anything until the plane reached Jodhpur, and they chanted the Namokara mantra. The plane miraculously landed safely at Jodhpur despite being overloaded. The pilot, who was a Sikh, was amazed by the experience and asked to see the murtis. The Jain community asked him to leave non vegetarian food and drinks before he could view the murtis, which he obliged. The idols and Jinavani are now located at Adarsh Nagar Multan Jain Temple in Jaipur, and people can visit them. This story highlights the traumatic experiences of the Jain community during the partition, where they had to leave behind their homes and belongings and risk their lives to save their murtis and Jinavani. The fear, uncertainty, and loss they experienced during this time left a lasting impact on their lives. But just imagine the devotion that these people had in order to be able to make a choice like this in such dire circumstances.
right. Very relevant, and it's very pertinent to highlight these points as we talk about Multan and the dharmic, legacy, as well as the Jain legacy, so to say. Just following on from that, there is a question on the Buddhist legacy as well, and it talks about a little broader kind of geography of sorts. I mean, the question is about Takshashila and the various other Buddhist monuments. And I think the question is on why we did not discuss that. So the our focus, I just want to contextualize the discussion, of course. Our focus today was on looking at Multan in particular and trying to see the civilizational battles and struggles that we have had, in the dharmic side, with a focus on that. But of course, we did speak about the learning centers, the centers of learning in, what is current day Pakistan, and how the Buddhists, the Jains, Hindus, and the Sikhs together kind of had various parallel but also convergent streams of resistance and unity and coherence, so to say. Deepak, do you have anything to add on that, on the Buddhist aspect and Takshashila in general?
Right. So Takshashila, of course, was the great center of learning in northern India at that time. It is named after Taksha. Taksha and Pushkala were the two sons of Bharata, Ram's brother. So Lahore and Kashur are named after Lava and Kusha, Ram's two sons. And these two cities are named after Bharata's two sons. Pushkala became, Pushkala, the city named after Pushkala became Pushkalavati, which is near Peshawar now. Peshawar, of course, at that time was known as Purushapura. And the city named after Taksha became Takshashila. So this city has always had a Hindu heritage as well. It is not primarily only Buddhist. Of course, I plan to be writing an entire article on Takshashila, just like I've written about Multan. Hopefully, that will be out soon. So I'll have a lot more to say at that time. For now, though, I would say it was it was one of the capitals of the Gandhara Empire as well. And if you look at the 16 Mahajanapadas that formed part of ancient India, the only one whose capitals are outside of today's India was the Gandhara Empire. All of their capitals are outside India. Even the what was the Cambodia kingdom, their capital is currently within India. It's Rajouri in Jammu and Kashmir. So it is really a painful memory to think about the loss of Gandhara and Takshashila to Pakistan. But that is not to say that we cannot find ways to revive the traditions and knowledge systems of that place, of that era in India today itself. And that is what we should strive to do.
Very true and very relevant. I think we have had a rather insightful and informative discussion today. So we'll be following on from this discussion with another session. So today we focused more on the ancient and medieval history and the struggles and resistance of the Hindu side with respect to other civilizations and other forces. We'll be moving more into the modern context in our next discussion session. So I would like to thank Deepak for joining us today for this discussion, and we look forward to kind of going ahead and giving as comprehensive a discussion on this front and trying to reclaim and reinforce the dharmic heritage of Multan in particular and Pakistan in general.
Thank you, Dr. Majumdar, for the great questions and for this chance to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart and a topic that matters to all of us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Deepak. Thank you all for joining, and we will be airing the next discussion session in the coming week, and we look forward to having you there. Namaskar.